Welcome back. The president's former campaign chairman, of course, is on trial. His former personal attorney is the focus of a federal investigation. And a special counsel named Robert Mueller, who's investigating Russia, that's still going on. But President Trump has another legal headache. And it's a headache that threatens to expose his past business dealings. And it's a headache that could even expose publicly his tax returns. It's a lawsuit that was filed by the District of Columbia and Maryland's attorneys general, accusing Mr. Trump of violating the Constitution's emoluments clause by accepting foreign government's money at his D.C. hotel. A federal judge recently rejected the president's latest efforts to stop this lawsuit. And barring a last-minute appeal, which could happen, the suit now heads to the discovery phase. And of course, that's where things could get interesting and, well, a bit ugly. And that's where we could learn more about which foreign government officials have stayed at the Trump Hotel in D.C. We could find out how much they paid during their stays. And perhaps most importantly, the public may get its eyes on the president's tax returns that he has been so reluctant to reveal, at least the 2017 ones, nothing before that. So here with me now is one of the plaintiffs in this lawsuit. It's Maryland's Attorney General, Brain Frosh. Mr. Attorney General, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Chuck.
Okay, so in pretty simple terms, the emoluments clause, you're filing under the emoluments clause. Why does the state of, explain why the state of Maryland has standing. How is the state of Maryland being harmed by the president's hotel in Washington, D.C.? Explain it.
Well, we've claimed standing on a number of different bases. The judge has found that we have standing because we have institutions that compete with the Trump Post Office Hotel in Maryland, and we have constituents, businesses in our state that compete with the Trump Post Office Hotel.
Biggest one being Marriott, actually.
Yeah,
for what it's worth, it would be Marriott. I'm curious, did you ask any of the private companies to join you in this lawsuit?
We did not.
Okay.
Standing is, we've also argued, when we joined the union, Maryland joined the union, we made a deal. We ceded sovereignty to the federal government with the understanding that the president was going to put our interests first, not look at his bottom line and have that guide the country. That's the purpose. There are original anti-corruption laws. There are two emoluments clauses.
Here's what the Trump Organization tells NBC News. They strongly maintain there is absolutely nothing unconstitutional about a foreign government paying for a hotel room, and what his lawyers call a routine business transaction having nothing to do with his presidency. What do you say to that argument? Well,
the judge has said that they're wrong. Their interpretation of the emoluments clause is tailored to suit Donald Trump's interests, and it conflicts with the plain meaning of the clauses and with what is very clearly the intent of the framers of the Constitution.
For what it's worth, let's put up the emoluments clause here. No person holding any office of profit or trust under them under the United States shall, without the consent of the Congress, accept of any present emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state.
Right. And you'll notice that that clause has four uses of the word any.
Yes.
It's very broad, of any kind whatever. And the Justice Department, arguing on behalf of the president, has said, oh, it's very narrow. It's only if he's making a profit. The root word comes from a Latin word that means to grind corn. So only if he's actually engaged in manual labor and making a profit from it would that be an emolument. And the judge found that it's any kind of gain, profit, or advantage. And that's clearly what the framers were going for.
What's amazing here, and I think people don't, it is the Department of Justice and not a personal lawyer that is defending the president. Is this because who are you suing here? The office of the president? Or are you suing the individual Donald Trump?
Our original complaint, we sued Donald Trump, President of the United States. We've amended it to include him as an individual. Right now, he's being defended exclusively. In the original part of the case, he's being defended exclusively by the Justice Department, so we're paying for his defense. But he also has private counsel that has entered appearances to defend against the suit against him as an individual.
If he can prove that he has donated all his foreign profits back to the federal treasury, does that get him out of this?
Not good enough.
Why?
Because he's receiving payments from foreign states and foreign princes. I mean, there was just an article last week about
the Saudis. The
Saudi prince who had all his retainers stay at the Trump Hotel in New York. And so they would like to define it as profit, pure profit, and they claim it's $151,000, which seems insanely low. But it's not that. It's the receipt of payments themselves that violates the emoluments clause.
All right, let's say you win. What's the, what do you get?
Well,
What's the recourse?
At a bare minimum, he would have to stop receiving foreign payments.
So the governments right now, the Kuwait, Malaysia, the Philippines, Romania, they've all done events there. No official foreign entity could do any business at the Trump Hotel, or he would have to turn down that business?
He would have to stop receiving those payments. And how he does that is in part up to him and in part up to the court. There's another emoluments clause, the domestic emoluments clause, and it says the president gets only his salary during his term in office and no other emolument.
Right.
And the Trump Post Office Hotel lease itself is an emolument. It says that no federal official can receive any benefit from this lease.
So wait a minute, because there's also, we just learned this year in his new filing, there was an LLC formed where he earned $100,000 just off the sale of presidential paraphernalia. So is that, in this instance defined, then that's a violation of the domestic emolument clause?
His ownership of the lease certainly is.
So then owning an LLC, getting profits this way would be too?
I was unaware of the fact that he's actually selling mugs and
we
hats
were
and
too
whatever.
when we saw this LLC. We earned $100,000. He reported income based on that.
Yeah, well, the short answer is he can't profit from being president of the United States. And that's what both emoluments clauses are set up to prohibit. And he is the first person in history to profiteer from this high office.
Does that extend to his family? I mean, if his sons are profiting off of the office, but it's not him, does that get him out of this?
Well, we're not suing his sons.
No, I understand that.
And his daughter is a federal official of some kind and prohibited by the Foreign Emoluments Clause from receiving any payments, emoluments of any kind, whatever, from foreign states.
All right, last question. Discovery is going to happen soon,
yes.
Assuming this appeal gets denied, the next, or whether they do appeal or not. When is the soonest that we might see discovery, which might mean the tax returns?
Well, the judge asked us for a schedule, and it's due next week. So we are in negotiations right now with the Justice Department to determine how quickly we will get discovery and what happens after that. This
is one of the under-radar legal problems for the president. Brain Frosh, thanks for coming in and explaining your side of this. Very
enjoyed
interesting.
it a lot, Chuck. Thank you.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.